You're watching the benchmark test between the Exynos 2100 processor, the Snapdragon 888, and the Snapdragon 865 Plus. And if you guys want to see more videos like this, make sure you like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell so you'll be notified the next time I upload a video. Alright, so the Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra on the left is the Exynos 2100 processor. The S21 Ultra in the middle is the Snapdragon 888 processor, and the Note 20 Ultra on the right is the Snapdragon 865 Plus processor. We're going to be running 3 different benchmark tests, Antutu, Geekbench 5, and 3DMark. Now on our previous benchmark test between the S21 Ultras for the Exynos and Snapdragon processor, I only allowed 2 or 3 minutes in between each of the tests for cooling, because in real life tests you don't really pause in between games or applications on your phone, so I wanted to get more realistic results. However, on this test, I will allow each of the phones to completely cool down in between each of the tests so we can see how high the scores can go. I'll also be running all of the tests with enhanced processing disabled, and then I'll run them again with enhanced processing enabled so we can see if there's a difference. I have all of the brightnesses set to 100%. I've also disabled adaptive brightness. Now all 3 of these phones come stock with the adaptive 120Hz refresh rate enabled, so I'm just going to leave that enabled. So again, that means all 3 of these are going to be running with the 120Hz refresh rate. I'm turning off some of the lighting so the screens show better. Here's a quick look at the processor information on CPU-Z. So before we begin, let's check the temperatures. We have about 25.4 degrees, almost 26 degrees Celsius on the Exynos. About 26 degrees on the Snapdragon 888. And about 27.2 degrees on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. Alright, let's go ahead and start the first test. Alright, so the Exynos 2100 finished first, and it scored 651,027. The Snapdragon 888 finished next, with a score of 681,719. And the Snapdragon 865 Plus finished last, at 573,595. And here are the temperatures. We got about 38 degrees Celsius on the Exynos. About the same, 38 degrees on the Snapdragon. And about 36.7 degrees on the Snapdragon 865. Alright, now let's go ahead and run the stress test. Alright, so once the tests are done, the Exynos 2100 scored around 80% for the CPU performance and was more consistently staying around the 80% range, while the Snapdragon 888 was going up and down between 50% and 100%, but more often came lower towards the 60% range. As far as the Snapdragon 865, it stayed between the 80 to 100% range more often, but it did have spikes below towards the 50% range and ended around the 60% range. As far as temperatures go, we got about 39.7 on the Exynos, or 39.9. 39.3, 39.1 on the Snapdragon. And we got about 35.8 on the 865. Alright, now we're going to run the Geekbench test. Alright, before we start, we're at about 25.6 on the Exynos. About 25.4, 25.6 area on the Snapdragon 888. And about the same on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. Alright, I guess I gotta turn on Wi-Fi for this test. Now that we have Wi-Fi turned on, let's begin the tests. Alright, so once all tests are done, on the Exynos 2100, we got 1120 on the single core and 3631 on the multi-core. On the Snapdragon 888, we got 1128 on the single core and 3497 on the multi-core. As for the Snapdragon 865, we got 952 on the single core and 3048 on the multi-core. Temperatures, we got about 31.9, 32 degrees Celsius on the Exynos, about 31.9 on the Snapdragon 888, and about 32.6 on the Snapdragon 865. Alright, before we start the 3DMark test, let's check the temperatures. What about 23.4, 24.1, about 24.6. Alright, let's start. Alright, so let's see the scores. So on the Exynos 2100, we got 5892. On the Snapdragon 888, we got 5750. And on the Snapdragon 865 Plus, we got 4180. Temperatures are at about 29.4. Same over here, about 29.7. Now it's going up to 30. About 29 degrees on this one. So the average frame rate per second on the Exynos was 35.3. On the Snapdragon 888 was 34.4, and the Snapdragon 865 Plus was 25. And the frame rate went between 23 FPS to 44 FPS on the Exynos 2100, 24 FPS to 42 FPS on the Snapdragon 888, and 17 FPS to 31 FPS on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. Alright, now before we begin the 3DMark stress test, we're at about 23.6, 23.9. Same here. And about 23.4 here. Alright, let's go ahead and start. Alright, so once the tests are done, let's see the scores. So for best loop score, on the Exynos processor, we got 5,799. Lowest loop score, 3,744. And the stability is 64.6%. On the Snapdragon 888, best loop score was 5,731. Lowest loop score, 3,434. And stability was at 59.9. On Snapdragon 865 Plus, best loop score was 4,174, lowest loop score was 4,140, and stability was at 99.2%. So already looking at this, the stability on the Snapdragon 865 Plus far exceeds the stability on the other two phones. Temperatures, we're looking at about 40.6, 40.8. The same on the Snapdragon, maybe 41.3 on the Snapdragon 888. And about 42.5 on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. So let's go down. So here are the loop scores for the Exynos. And here are the ones for Snapdragon. And here's the one for the Snapdragon 865 Plus. So the Snapdragon 865 Plus was very consistent throughout the scores. The Snapdragon 888 seemed to go up and down in between, and the Exynos 2100 was fairly consistent. It started at a higher level and just kept going down consistently from there. So as far as the battery percentages go, on the Exynos it used about 10% battery. On the Snapdragon 888 it used about 12% battery, and on the Snapdragon 865 Plus it used about 12% battery as well. Temperature wise, they all seem fairly close. The Snapdragon 888 was about 1 degree higher at the hottest temperature. As far as frame rates go, for the Exynos it was 13 frames per second to 43 frames per second. For the Snapdragon 888 it was 14 frames per second to 42 frames per second. And on the Snapdragon 865 Plus was 18 frames per second to 31 frames per second. Alright, now we're going to run all the tests again, but this time we're going to enable enhanced processing on the phones. And then we're going to see what the results are. Alright, let's begin the Antutu test. Alright, now that the tests are done, with enhanced processing, it seemed the 865 Plus ran the test just a little bit faster than the 888. Let's take a quick temperature test. We got about 41.3 on the Exynos. We got about 40.4, 39.7 on the Snapdragon 888. And about 38 on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. As far as scores go, on the Exynos we have 634,011. On the Snapdragon 888 we have 681,099. And on the Snapdragon 865 Plus we have 579,373. Now as far as the temperatures, the benchmark shows the Snapdragon 888 increased in temperature by 11.8 degrees Celsius, while the Exynos 2100 only increased in 10.9 degrees Celsius, and the Snapdragon 865 Plus increased 7.8 degrees in Celsius as far as the processor goes. Alright, now we're going to run the Antutu stress test. Alright, so now that the tests are done, let's take a quick temperature test. We got about 42.7 degrees Celsius on the Exynos, about 41.3 on the Snapdragon 888, and about 39.3 on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. Again, keep in mind this is the outside temperatures and not the actual CPU temperatures. For CPU temperatures, the Snapdragon 888 was running just a little bit 0.5 degrees hotter than the Exynos 2100 at the end of the test. Now for CPU performance, the Exynos 2100 was between the 60 to 80% range for the majority of the test. At one point near the beginning, it shot up to 100%. As for the Snapdragon 888, it was also around the 60 to 80% range for the majority of the test, and it shot up to 100% a couple of times throughout the test. Now for the Snapdragon 865 Plus, it ranged between 60 to 100%, and it bounced back and forth quite often, but it did hit 100% more often than the other ones. Alright, now it's time to run the Geekbench test. Alright, now that the tests are done, let's check the temperatures. We got about 31.7 on the Exynos, about 31.5, 31.7 on the Snapdragon as well, and about 32.9, 33 on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. Now we're going to run the 3DMark Wildlife test. Alright, now that the tests are done, let's see the scores. So the Exynos 2100 overall score is 6,151. Snapdragon 888 overall score is 5,724. And the Snapdragon 865 Plus overall score is 4,172. Average frame rate on the Exynos 2100 was 36.8. Average frame rate on the Snapdragon 888 was 34.3. For the Snapdragon 865 Plus was 25. We got about 29.7 degrees Celsius on the Exynos. The same for the Snapdragon 888. And about 27.9 degrees Celsius on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. For the Exynos 2100 and the Snapdragon 888, the temperatures seem to be running fairly the same, which is 24 degrees Celsius to 29 degrees Celsius for the processor. As for the 865 Plus, it was 23 degrees Celsius to 26 degrees Celsius. On the Exynos 2100, the frame rates ranged between 23 FPS to 47 FPS. On the Snapdragon 888, 24 frames per second to 42 frames per second. And on the Snapdragon 865 Plus, 16 frames per second to 31 frames per second. Alright, now we're going to start the wildlife stress test. Alright, now that the tests are done, let's check out the scores. For the Exynos 2100, the best loop score was 6,179. Lowest loop score was 3,802. Stability was at 61.5%. For the Snapdragon 888, best loop score was 5,735. Lowest loop score was 3,437. And stability was at 59.9%. For the Snapdragon 865 Plus, best loop score is 4,168. Lowest loop score is 4,138. And stability was at 99.3%. So we can see the stability on the Snapdragon 865 Plus is much better than the Snapdragon 888 and the Exynos 2100. As far as temperatures go, we got about 40 degrees on the Exynos, about the same on the Snapdragon 888, and 42.6 degrees on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. So here are the loop scores. So we can see on the Snapdragon 865 Plus, is very stable and stayed at a consistent number all the way throughout. As far as the Snapdragon 888, the performance started degrading a little bit towards the middle, and at times it spiked up a few times. As for the Exynos 2100, it degraded halfway through as well, but overall it stayed more consistent and didn't really have much spikes in the test. And as far as battery drain goes on the Exynos 2100, it went from 49% to 37%. On the Snapdragon 888, it went from 48% to 35%, and on the Snapdragon 865 Plus, it went from 54% to 41%. The temperature range for the Exynos 2100 was 23 degrees Celsius to 42 degrees Celsius. On the Snapdragon 888 was 23 degrees Celsius to 43 degrees Celsius, so about 1 degree Celsius hotter, and 23 degrees Celsius to 43 degrees Celsius on the Snapdragon 865 Plus. For the frame rates on the Exynos 2100, it was 14 frames per second to 46 frames per second. On the Snapdragon 888 was 15 frames per second to 42 frames per second, and the Snapdragon 865 Plus was 18 frames per second to 31 frames per second. Now some people were mentioning that there's a possibility if you enable power saving mode on the Exynos processor, it actually increases the scores on the test results. So we're going to quickly check that out as well and see what we get. I'm going to run a Geekbench test first. So as far as the scores go, single core is 1120 and multi-core is 3457. So compared with the power saving mode off, the single core is 2 points higher. However, the multi-core score scored only 3457 compared to the 3634 when the power saving mode was off. Now we're going to run the stress test and see the results of that. Alright, so the test is done. Best loop score was 5,794 and lowest loop score is 4,767. The stability was at 82.3%. So as far as the best loop score, it didn't do any better, but for the lowest loop score, it seemed to do much better. When we ran this test with the power saver mode off, the lowest loop score was only 3,744. Also, the stability was at 64.6%, compared to the stability now, which is at 82.3%. So I guess it is possible with the power saving mode, you do get some benefits. And here are your different loop scores. Actually, taking a look at this, it seems to be much better when running it in power saving mode when you're using it in long duration. So it's possible when you're using it during gameplay, it might be running better and you might be getting better results. Kind of weird, but I don't know why it's like that. As far as battery, it shows it went from 34% to 20%, which means it used 14% battery, which is actually a greater battery usage compared to when the battery saving mode is off. So maybe it is some kind of a glitch when you actually turn battery saving mode on the Exynos 2100. It actually is turning it off and vice versa. As far as temperatures, it went between 23 degrees Celsius and 48 degrees Celsius. Frame rate was 23 frames per second to 41 frames per second. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and make sure you like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.